Is American patriotism, as well as love for Israel and the Jewish people, so out of style that most people alive today, especially the young, would find nothing to relate to in the story of an American hero of Israel's War of Independence? What can we learn from an examination of the life of a man whose example of service to both the United States and Israel long inspired many, but today seems to have been forgotten amid the deluge of woke and anti-Semitic invective that denigrates service to country, as well as a willingness to sacrifice that the Jewish state might live? Next, on Think Twice, we'll retell the story of one of the greatest American Jewish heroes and discuss why his example is so relevant to what is happening right now. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an interesting conversation for you with author Steven Ossad about his new book about one of the greatest of American Jewish heroes. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now, to today's program. It's been a while since our educational system emphasized the teaching of history. It used to be properly understood as an essential element not just to being an educated person, but also something without which it was impossible to comprehend world events and the most important issues of the day. But we currently live in an era when historical knowledge is considered an esoteric and unimportant aspect of education. To the extent that it is emphasized in our schools, it is generally held up for debunking and ridicule, as woke leftists seek to tear down the canon of Western civilization and persuade us that America is an irredeemably racist nation and Israel is an apartheid state. But if we do return to the study of history, we can learn not only about the past, but about ourselves. And as much as many contemporary historians denigrate the study of great individuals, what some deride as the great man theory of history, it is impossible to understand much of what has happened without delving into the lives of people who did make a difference, without whom history might have turned out very differently. One such person was David Mickey Marcus, a West Point graduate, American lawyer, judge, and New York City commissioner who served in World War II and then volunteered to help organize and then lead the ragtag forces who were seeking to defend the life of the newborn Jewish state in 1948. Marcus, serving under an assumed name, Michael Stone, had the rank of Aloof, the first in 2,000 years, played a vital role as the underground Haganah was transformed into the Israel Defense Forces as the Jewish state was invaded by 5 armies on the first day of its existence as a modern state. Once the central figure in a major Hollywood film about his life, he's been largely forgotten outside of Israel. But a new biography of Marcus now not only is helping to revive his legacy and to debunk some myths about him, but seeking to place his story in the context not only of American Jewish and Israeli history, but also of the debate about the U.S.-Israel relationship and the Jewish state's struggle for survival. And we're pleased to have the author of that book with us today. Steven Ossad is a biographer, historian, and retired Wall Street technology analyst focused on leadership and command in the U.S. military. He is the author of the award-winning 2017 biography, Omar Nelson Bradley, America's GI General, and co-author of the 2006 book, Major General Maurice Rose, World War II's greatest forgotten commander, and his latest, Chasing the Shadow, Mickey Marcus's 200 Days of Destiny. Steven Ossad, welcome to Think Twice.
Wonderful to be here.
Well, Steven, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about why the story of Mickey Marcus needs to be retold in 2025. Who was he for those who don't know about his story, and why is it relevant to us today?
Mickey Marcus was the immigrant son, the youngest son of Romanian immigrants fleeing persecution from Romania. He was born on Washington's birthday at the turn of the century, the last century, 1901. He then went on to West Point, very unusual for a Jewish boy at that time, and was the 1923 welterweight boxing champion, the intercollegiate champion. And that gave him terrific visibility throughout his whole life, as did his association with West Point. I would say that West Point was, if not the necessary condition to yield David, Daniel, Mickey Marcus. From West Point, and remember, this was right after World War I.
Right, in the 1920s. Yeah.
In 1920, he was admitted to a very, very rapidly enlarged class. He was commissioned into the infantry. A real stroke of luck. He did not have an easy time. Deciding that there was no future for him in the army, he tapped some of his contacts and was able to get a job first in Treasury as a lawyer.
He wasn't an active Zionist. He wasn't really actively observant either, was he?
He was a member of one of the first Reform synagogues in the United States, a very, very significant jewel at that time, but very, very liberal. I think the only evidence that I found of any connection to Eretz Yisrael was the blue Jewish National Fund coin box in his grandma's house. So I remember that in my grandma's house. So that was the only real connection, although he was active in Jewish philanthropic organizations, but mostly politically based. At the beginning of World War II, he got himself transferred as a JAG in the 27th Infantry Division, and he went off. In those days, early on, the Army was expanding dramatically.
Okay. Now, I want to pause in this narrative and let's talk about the reason why many people found out about him in the United States in the 1960s, which is a famous film that was a project of Kirk Douglas, in which he plays Mickey Marcus. It's a biopic where Douglas plays Marcus. And in that film, there is one of the sort of key incidents of World War II in its depiction of him. And it's also in the first biography by Ted Berkman, which was named Cast a Giant Shadow. The movie took that name. According to that book and then the movie, Mickey Marcus jumped into Normandy, with the airborne troops on D-Day. That's part of the lore of Marcus. But you found out something different, didn't you?
It's a completely made-up story.
Mm-hmm.
And
Berkman knew it was a made-up story.
Did he?
Yes. And the reason that we know that is because of John McGinnis. Now, who was John McGinnis? He was a 40-something coal salesman in Massachusetts who was also a reserve officer. And he was one of a team of thousands of soldiers. As I said, this new group, Civil Affairs and Military Government, they recruited teams of people who would go into captured cities and villages and set up civil administration. McGinnis was in charge of, or would be in charge of, ruling, in effect, the city of Carentan in France, which was slated to be liberated very early in the invasion of
And
Normandy.
indeed it was in the first
And
month.
indeed it was. Mickey, sitting in the Pentagon just before D-Day, convinced his boss to let him go to England first and then France and be there in the early days of the invasion so he could report on what they had actually done and how it worked on the battlefield. So Mickey was assigned to one of these teams. McGinnis was in charge of the team. And later on, McGinnis wrote his memoir, A Journal of Military Government, it's called. Very famous, important work in this discipline. And he describes two encounters that he had, long-term encounters with Mickey Marcus. One began in England before D-Day, the one we're talking about now, and one after the war. We'll get to that later. Mickey got to Normandy with McGinnis on an amphibious boat. He sloshed ashore with his stuff like tens of thousands of other GIs on D+2. He did not jump out of an airplane. He couldn't jump out of an airplane. He had never had any training. It would have been a death sentence.
I guess the real question there is, did he boast of doing something that he didn't do? That didn't seem to be in character with his life and previous or subsequent career. It's hard to imagine, the guy who is the, sort of tough, honest lawyer in New York making up, a war story, as Shakespeare, says in Henry V, with advantages. But did he do that?
No, he didn't. In fact, he was sly. He was a lawyer. And when people would say, wow, that must have been incredible jumping out of an airplane, he would give an answer like, there was a lot of difficulty in getting transport in the invasion. Now, that's not...
So he didn't deny it.
That's not exactly a denial.
So he kind of enjoyed that people had made up the story about him and let it be out there.
I think it's also fair to say that he was a politician and he knew the value of a tall tale not denied. So, yes.
It reminds me of Lyndon Johnson in World War II, who had one flight on an airplane and turned that into, a decoration and a long career posing as a veteran. But not quite stolen valor in that way, but obviously he didn't deny a story, and it became lore. It became, it's still on his Wikipedia page.
Exactly. Like I said, this is a story filled with legends and myths, and I found myself looking up all those terms and what they mean.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to dwell too much on that, although we could talk more about the movie, which is awful but interesting in a way. Let's talk about, in the immediate aftermath of the war, he was involved in setting up, finding out about war crimes and the Nazis. Tell us a little bit about that before we get to the main drama of his life, which occurs in 1947 and 48.
Well, again, after the war, remember, Mickey had worked on the architecture of the occupation from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. He had an still classified role in drafting the surrender of Italy. And I suspect he was there on the ground, although I couldn't find any direct proof. So he was an architect of the post-war era, no less than a lot of other much more prominent figures. So in the immediate aftermath of the war, in fact, just before, when they started deciding how they would rule Germany, it was pretty clear that Eisenhower would be the military governor, but it was not clear what would happen underneath him. And again, to make a very long story, bureaucratic history short, the number 2 guy, Lucius Clay, a distinguished soldier in his own right, knew Mickey Marcus and tabbed him right away, requested him by name, which is not that usual in the Army for requesting somebody to fill a new role. And he was in Europe shortly after the end of the war. It was at that time also that he visited the newly liberated Dachau concentration camp. And although I never found any direct references by him or any references by people that he had spoken to except for McGinnis, it's clear to me that that was the profound lever, let's say, that turned Marcus into a hardcore Zionist. Well, we have to now look at what was going on half a world away. Mm-hmm. In mid-1947, when Mickey got back most American GIs had already come back. And so he went back into the law. He got some office space and he was starting to practice law, but it was slow. And that's where we found him. Meanwhile, in what was then the British Mandate of Palestine, there was negotiation going on in the United Nations about what to do in Palestine. And the proposal was before the General Assembly to partition, that is, to divide this land, which had been given to Great Britain after they had defeated the Ottoman Empire, and this small province, backwater, agricultural, poor province of Palestine, was going to be divided into a Jewish state. The Jews were a minority in what was defined then as Palestine, and a larger Arab Muslim population. And there would be two states. Well, we know what happened. The General Assembly approved that, and the war began the next day, a civil war to begin with.
After the UN votes for partition in the late 1947, the fighting already begins.
Right. Earlier that month, however, in the first week of November, the man responsible for Haganah operations in North America, Haganah, the secret underground army of the main political party in Israel, and under the direct command of David Ben-Gurion, the founder, the George Washington of the state of Israel, was desperate to organize his underground militia forces and to try to gain control over other political militias on the right who were acting independently to build a national army. Now, bear in mind, this is 3 weeks before the vote, and there had already been guerrilla warfare by the local Arabs and responses by the local Haganah and its strike force called the Palmach, its permanently mobilized force. Also, bear in mind, we're talking now about a group that in total might have been 30,000 people. So very,
In the
very
Haganah.
small. In the Haganah. And that's if they brought in all of their reservists. And the Palmach, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people. So very small. And Ben-Gurion knew that he had to build an army quickly and that he was going to be under fire almost immediately. And most important, there were no soldiers in the Haganah or the Irgun or the Lehi, the Sterngag, the main organized Jewish units that had any experience above company level. There were no battalion or regimental commanders. There were no staff officers of a modern army. So their first requirement, Ben-Gurion realized, was to get somebody who knew what to do, hopefully a general, an American general, who would come with a small group of officers, staff officers, and help set up a modern mechanized army. Now, the man who was responsible for that, Shlomo Shamir, and I spent a lot of time learning about Shlomo Shamir. And I'm not sure I would have been able to write this book, at least the second part of the book about Israel, without that contact. Shamir recruited Marcus. He was with Marcus during most of the early his first visit to Israel. And he was taken by the man to the point that he wrote about him, thought about him for the rest of his life. And his daughter kept an archive of that material, and that's what I used in telling the second part of this story and why we're talking about him now, why he was important. Shamir originally got the idea from a few other people who knew Marcus, and he made the introduction. It was a very dramatic moment. There was the underground foreign minister of then Palestine named Moshe Sharet. He was a personal witness, and he knew people who knew Marcus. Originally, the idea was Marcus would help them find a general. And they did scouting. There was a list of 24 American officers that they asked, some very famous names on that list. The fact remains that on that list, there were illustrious generals, most of whom were retired. But it turned out that none of them were willing to do this, even though they were sympathetic. And that was a requirement that Ben-Gurion put on Shamir. He did not want a mercenary.
Mm-hmm.
He knew that it would be very difficult to find a Jewish general, but he wanted somebody who believed in the cause. I think that's important to note right up front.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually they settled on one name, a man named Ralph Smith. I mentioned him earlier. He was Mickey's boss in the 27th Infantry Division, but he was not able to convince himself because there were risks involved. This would have been working for an underground army that was not an ally of the United States. In fact, it had a difficult and would have a difficult relationship with the colonial power, England. That was our ally.
Right.
So that was one major problem. And the second problem was, if that did turn into a problem, then the pension of a general officer would have been in doubt. So everybody said no. In the middle of January, Ben-Gurion called Shamir back. And at that point, he still didn't have anybody. But he got closer to the idea that Mickey was the man. And so he offered to take Marcus back. Once again, Emma turned out to be crucial. Shamir met Emma, went to their home, looked through their photo albums, and saw that it would be very difficult. And he enlisted others, prominent Zionists, to help convince her. But in the end, I think Mickey was going to do it anyway. Think about it. Who turns down the opportunity to be a major factor in the establishment of an army and a country, having seen Dachau days after its liberation and having developed over this period of time the realization that the only hope for Jews was a land and an army. And I emphasize the second part of that, a Jewish army. Without that, history had already declared what the fate of the Jews would be. And so he made up his mind to go. And that's where the story really takes off.
Yeah. Now, I think just it's important to pause for a moment and to put yourself in the position of an American Jew who had served in World War II, done, as they said then, his bit, and more than most people. Lots of Jews were asked to volunteer and join what became the Machal, the volunteers who joined the new IDF as it was formed, as it would be formed. Most didn't want to do it. It was only a small number of people did that, just because you've already been in a war. You're going to go looking for another one. It takes a special kind of person with a special sense of, I guess, mission, as well as a sense of adventure. And that was certainly what Mickey Marcus was.
I don't think there's any question about that. In fact, Emma, in one of the letters describing this decision, quoted the old poem that he had a longing for death, a death wish. And I think that it was also obvious when he finagled his way to get to the combat zone that he had a hunger to be there. As I said before, I think it would be very hard to resist the invitation that he had to be a major. I have to say that I've done work a while ago interviewing surviving Mahal members for a Hadassah dinner in San Francisco. It was a terrific personal experience. I interviewed about 15 Mahalniks. And their stories were all over the place, and their motivations were all over the place. You're right. It takes a special impetus to go and do that. But I think for the people who did go, roughly 3,500 is the best figure, of which maybe 1,500 were North Americans. The greatest preponderance were Americans, and then a lesser number of Canadians. I think that they saw that this was a world war of Jews, that this was the war of Jews, and that if this failed, Jews would not be safe. Now, we grew up in a world where that, I think, would have been hard to believe when we were young, you and I. But these people still felt that. They had seen it, not just the Holocaust, but their own personal stories. I am personally named after a maternal grandfather who was killed in a pogrom in the Ukraine. Now, however, it's unfortunately easier to see how Jews without arms are at the mercy of history. I think those who went felt that. Of course, there were adventurers, and there were people and I've met and interviewed many, young and old, who admit to the thrill of combat. And as you say, most of these people were combat veterans. So there's a documentary that's being made about Mickey Marcus right now. And the documentary makers put it to me as to whether I thought Mickey was like the lone soldiers today who go to Israel and make Aliyah to serve in the IDF, not as a family venture, but by themselves. And I think, yes, in many ways, he was one of the first. It's also a technical detail, but there was no Mahal organization in the Provisional Government of Israel, and even after independence, that dealt with Mahal. So technically, he was not a Mahalnik. And finally, Mickey Marcus was a paid consultant. He earned $750 a month, which was, by my reckoning as a ex-Wall Street analyst and the research I did, was about a 25% discount from an actual general, but was still a lot of money in 1948. So to call him a volunteer is not exactly right. But he went, and as the story unfolded, he paid the supreme price.
Right. Now, how important, he arrives really before the state is declared. How important is he in the formation of what would become the Israel Defense Forces as it transitions from underground militias into an actual army fighting for its life, fighting for the life of the Jewish state in a war where 1% of the Jewish population actually dies in that war, a much higher percentage than any subsequent war. I mean, an unimaginable number, if you put it in another context. Just how important is Mickey Marcus to creating the IDF?
I wanted to claim that he was the founder of the IDF, but there are some problems with that. One, and the most important problem, is his duration of service. He basically spent two distinct periods in Israel. The first was from the beginning of February to the beginning of April. During that period of time, under the direction of Ben-Gurion, he made a field inspection to all of the fighting fronts, and he spent a lot of time in what was called the Red House, which was Haganah headquarters on the beach in Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
He
The
spoke
precursor to today's Syria, Israel's Pentagon.
exactly, but just a regular 2 stories, I think, building. No security, no protection, just sitting right there. And after he came back from his field visits, during which he met most of the field commanders, they were not told who he was in fact, but he got to meet them, and they knew that he was an important American advisor to Ben Gurion. So he had a pretty good idea of how things were set up at that time. He came back, and his assignment was to write training manuals for his first recommendation, which was to set up a training school for battalion level commanders and staff. He made his recommendations and wrote the manuals not by memory, which is another myth about this. He actually had the United States manuals, all kinds of field manuals, with him in Israel. I've seen photographs of them with his initials. So he either was able to bring them with him when he went the first time, or he was able to get them through Haganah couriers and so on. So he adapted these manuals for the force that he was creating, which had roots primarily in the British Army. Much like the American Army, we derived our main structures, our culture, our organizational tables, and so on from the British Army. And so did the IDF, with a dose of experience from the partisans who had fought in World War II, as well as the indigenous organization of the Haganah and Palmach. But he was becoming increasingly frustrated because he was not given real authority.
Mm-hmm.
So
and there was also the language barrier.
He did not speak any Hebrew. He was like me. He could read a prayer book, I think, but probably not even that well. And he certainly didn't know any spoken Hebrew. So yes, that was a problem with some of the commanders. At that point in April, he went back to the United States. Now, he kept telling everyone that he would be back, and that when the moment of truth came, after the Declaration of Independence, which was scheduled for mid-May of 1948.
When the British were to withdraw.
The next day, May 15th. And there's a long description in my book about that and what led up to that. And most important, what led up to Harry Truman's recognition, the de facto recognition, not the de jure recognition, the technical legal recognition, but the practical recognition. As an example, although I'm not entirely sure it's directly comparable, it was kind of like what just happened in Syria, where a completely provisional government with questionable origins that had been born in warfare was suddenly recognized by the United States and by others, in the sense that we're having formal discussions with the provisional government of Syria.
As we would say in Hebrew, lahavdil, between, newborn Israel and what's going on now in Syria, but we'll get back to
that perhaps, but that's what happened. And that was the absolute decision of one man. The power of the President of the United States is awesome. And it's no exaggeration to say that the relationship between Israel and the United States has been and remains very heavily dependent on the individual who occupies that office.
Which is true to this day, obviously. And just to place it in context is that much of the U.S. government, certainly people in the Pentagon, then Secretary of State George Marshall, whom we encountered before in this story when he was the head of the U.S. Army, they were all against recognition of Israel. And in fact, even after Truman recognizes Israel, the United States doesn't do anything to help Israel survive the War of Independence. Not a bullet, not a penny. And in fact, whatever aid it gets from the United States is clandestine, basically organized by criminals.
Exactly right. But things have changed so much that it's hard to imagine now how important something like a United Nations General Assembly vote actually was, and how important the recognition itself was by the United States. It's true that even as early as December 1947, when Mickey was considering whether to even do this, an arms embargo was slapped on both sides by the United States, even though it was well known that Britain was continuing to supply advanced weapons to the Arab states.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no doubt that the then newly reorganized Defense Department, at that same time in United States history, the entire structure of the national security establishment of the United States was undergoing a profound change. The Department of Defense, which had been the War Department, was set up, including civilian secretaries of the branches. The National Security Council, which has become unbelievably important but didn't exist before 1947, amended 1949, was just being established. The CIA was brand new and had just taken over from OSS. So there was a lot going on at that time. I think that personally, one of my real disappointments, and it wasn't the first time encountering this when writing this book, was to see just how anti-Semitic the State Department, and particularly George Marshall, who I revered as a boy and as an early student of military history of the United States, just how bad it really was. Marshall threatened Truman to his face in a meeting that he would vote against Truman if he recognized Israel, and he would make that known. That's a staggering fact of American diplomatic history.
Yeah, and it's quite a thing because Truman is still a person who had been not elected as president. He had inherited the presidency when Franklin Roosevelt died. George Marshall is a larger-than-life hero that Truman reveres. But Truman still stood up to him. He didn't let him intimidate him. He was the president and didn't let the general dictate to him.
Here again, it's all about people. Truman had a best friend named Eddie Jacobson, who he had served with in the National Guard artillery in World War I. Jacobson was a fervent Zionist. He knew all the leaders, including Chaim Weizmann. And as background in the book, I describe what's going on in the White House. And at that time, leading up to the decision, it's also true that Truman was a Zionist. He was in favor of before he was president. And
yes,
finally,
he was, although he got very annoyed with the Zionists for making his life miserable while they were lobbying him to recognize Israel. Anybody who reads Truman, good biography of Truman knows that. But I don't want to get too sidetracked with the story of Truman and Eddie Jacobson, which is a great story, worthy of its own tale. Let's get back to Mickey Marcus. Israel is recognized. Israel is fighting for its life. What is Mickey Marcus doing? And how does he have an impact on Israel's ability to withstand those very trying days?
So Mickey comes back at the beginning of May. He gets right to work. Ben-Gurion notes this in his diary. And as soon as the action really begins after the Declaration of Independence, Truman sends Mickey first to Egypt, where the main threat is developing. A full mechanized Egyptian regiment, 5,000 men, 50 armored vehicles, is moving up the coastal road toward Tel Aviv. To the east, a column of Muslim brothers, the godfathers of Hamas, the godfathers of ISIS. They're still around. But then they were organized as guerrilla forces, and they made a flanking move on Beersheba. Marcus flew by small plane, went to the field, and immediately began advising. There was a critical battle forming around Yad Mordechai, and he advised the Negev Brigade commander in utilizing maneuver tactics with recently arrived armored vehicles from Czechoslovakia. And they were able to check that advance, and in a daring offensive, were able to attack Gaza at that time. In fact, Marcus claimed that with another few hundred men, he could have captured Gaza himself, something that came up later in the war, in the 1948 war. He came back to Jerusalem just in time for the cataclysmic and most important battle in the 1948 war, the battle for the road to Jerusalem. The road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem runs through gorges and mountains up to the high city. It had been cut several times during the fighting in the Civil War period, but after the Declaration of Independence on May 14th, Arab armies invaded the state of Israel. And the main threat in the center of the country was from the Transjordanian Arab Legion, now Jordan, a British officered military unit that was created when the Brits cut the Mandate of Palestine in two and took the eastern portion, what is now east of the Jordan River, and put it under a monarch who they owed from World War I. And to protect that monarchy, they created the Arab Legion, which was and remains a very respected, professionally trained army. They were moving both on Jerusalem, which was at the end of a very exposed road, and they were trying to take the crossroads of Latrun, which was the entrance actually to the winding road as you approach it from Tel Aviv. This would have led to starvation and the surrender of the city. And Ben-Gurion decided he had to take Latrun as quickly as possible. The day that Ben-Gurion appointed Marcus an aluf, general, actually duke, lord, captain of 1,000 in Hebrew, a rank that didn't exist.
Yeah, this is
then.
a really important moment. This is sort of this is really a historic moment. Ben-Gurion gives him this rank. He's the first person to get this rank, isn't he?
First person to hold this rank since Judah the Hasmonean, Judah the Maccabee. So yes, very important. Now, to this day, again, easily sidetracked, whether he was technically the first general under the ordinance and rules and so on, is completely irrelevant. This is a situation where a slight exaggeration is exactly right. He was the first general of the modern Jewish army. He commanded the first mechanized division of the first Israeli army. And while the Battle of Latrun was an operational and tactical failure, that is, they did not dislodge the enemy from the road, there was an engineering solution in the works all along, also under the command of Marcus. Marcus, in answer partly to your question of why was he so important, Marcus was the originator of the concept of front commands. That is, when he first came, every brigade made up its own orders, decided its own strategy. Marcus took one look at the map and said, that's ridiculous. We need unity of command. That was one of his main principles and remains one of the main principles of the IDF. There were three commands: Northern, Central, Southern. The Central Command at that time was called the Jerusalem Front. Marcus was and is still listed in the West Point Register as the Commander, Jewish Forces, Jerusalem Front. Major moment in Israel
so
military
as you say,
history.
this engineering, which was nicknamed it the Burma Road after what happened in India, China, Burma front during World War II, they create a new route to Jerusalem. The siege is lifted. And, at this point, while Latrun wasn't a victory, he relieves Jerusalem. His brief time, it's only a very short time that he has this role, but it sort of ends in victory in that Jerusalem is relieved. There's a ceasefire, the first of some ceasefires, and then a tragic incident ends his life.
Exactly. It's June 10th. The next morning, the ceasefire will take place. Marcus was at the monastery of Abu Ghosh overlooking Jerusalem. The commanders were gathered around. They had a victory party the next day. It was a ceasefire, but the army survived. The country survived. And there was enough of an advantage to make a ceasefire a good idea. They were exhausted. There were still weapons still to come in, but there was a lot to celebrate, and they did. That night, about 3:30 in the morning, Marcus went out to relieve himself. It was cold, even in June at night. He wrapped himself in a white blanket, and he went out. Might have been a bit drunk. We don't know, because he ended up wandering outside of the perimeter of the facility. Maybe he didn't know that. We don't really know why he was there. But as he came back to approach the perimeter, he was challenged by a Palmach sentry, as it turned out, who challenged him for the password. The password, by the way, was in Hebrew, "The road is ours." But he didn't know that or remember it or didn't say it. And he blurted out. The sentry thought something in English. The sentry thought he might have been Arab Legion. He fired one warning shot from his Sten, and the figure kept moving closer, and he fired several more rounds. One of them struck Marcus in the heart and killed him instantly. So it was basically Stonewall Jackson, friendly fire incident, but a terrible blow to everyone, especially the commanders who had gotten to know him really well. And then he's buried in West Point, and
it's a very symbolic. His funeral becomes this great symbolic thing. He's, I believe, I believe he's the only West Point graduate buried at the West Point Cemetery who died fighting under a foreign flag.
Exactly.
And it's a big ceremony, and in a sense, it's symbolic of an alliance that is not yet in place, but would eventually become. He is the symbol of U.S.-Israel, relations and of American support for Israel. But he dies just at the moment of triumph, which, sort of is very dramatic. It leaves us wondering what his life would have been like after that had he not, been killed that in that awful way. But he does, serve as this symbol in a way that I think is very relevant. You write in your last chapter about the importance of the U.S.-Israel relationship and, how, sort of placing him in that context. That's kind of under fire, not just in part from people on the left who hate Israel and hate the United States as well, view the United States as an irredeemably racist nation, not, the standard bearer of freedom, who hate Israel, falsely call it an apartheid state. And we even have people on the right now, like Tucker Carlson, claiming that anybody who would fight for Israel as an American citizen should have their citizenship revoked. I don't know that he knows the Mickey Marcus story, but that's sort of under fire too. So he is, I think, sort of uniquely placed in history to show, the commitment of American Jews and of America to Israel's survival in a way that makes him really a unique historic figure. And though we throw the word hero around a lot sometimes, perhaps when we shouldn't, he is a hero, isn't he?
Oh, absolutely. I would say that the real source now and the real institutional interest in Marcus is in the United States Army, not in the American Jewish community at all, even though he was
Probably not in the IDF as well.
well, I think that, well, I hope to see what the reaction is by the IDF directly to this work that I've done. But I think there's much more of a consciousness in the ranks, the higher ranks of the IDF than in the Israeli public, let's say, who generally are exposed to the Mahalniks in general. Marcus is their main symbol. I think you're right about that completely. Also, West Point has become the actual holy ground of that symbolic relationship. As recently as 2015, the president of Israel, who was a foot soldier in 1948, Rivlin made a pilgrimage to West Point, and he was not the only politician, Israeli soldier, diplomat to do that. So,
yes, I believe it was Moshe Dayan was accompanied his body to, he was part of that, wasn't when he was...
Moshe Dayan and Joseph Hamburger, who was the captain of the Exodus, were both accompanying his body. Now, it's also a fact that neither
we should say that he fought under an assumed name. I think we skipped over that because, the fact that he was, a former high-ranking American officer at a time when America was not supposed to be involved in this war. He was there as Michael Stone, not as Mickey Marcus.
Mickey Stone. I think it's a real tribute to his older brother, Big Mike, who turned him on to boxing and was really the father figure. Marcus's father died when he was 10 years old and pretty much cast the family into poverty until they figured out how to deal with it. And Big Mike was a real influence. But yes, the entire story of Marcus was under another name, Mickey Stone. Just one note on the burial at West Point was strictly according to Army rules. The order is exactly the same as any other funeral. And it is true that others died fighting under foreign flats. I found a long list. But Marcus is the only one actually buried at West Point. The truth is that anybody who went to West Point can be buried there. So the fact that Marcus's burial is a footnote is telling. And the fact that it's Israel, for all the reasons that you just brought up about the political reality right now, is even more striking. And it's inconceivable that the legend on his grave, a soldier for all humanity, that could ever be put on anyone's grave now. But yes, a symbol of the American national security interests of the United States and Israel, a symbol of democratic values and an army that fights under a doctrine of purity that is greater than our own, an army and a culture that is united in basic beliefs, and common enemies that should be drawing us together, but I'm afraid are tearing us apart. My goal was to rescue a hero of childhood, as it turned out, but a hero that we need more than ever now as a symbol of what you just described, the close relationship between and the mutual interest between the United States and the State of Israel.
Yeah, how do you see, sort of Mickey Marcus's legacy? Is that, we said earlier there was a big Hollywood movie in the 60s, although it was something of a flop and terrible script. A lot of famous people in it, like John Wayne, and had a big star, Kirk Douglas, who was a great supporter of Israel and had, was always interested in making films in Israel, which he had done. I think the first major film, non-local film, was done right after the War of Independence, starring Kirk Douglas. But that story has been kind of lost. I mean, you could find it on Amazon, Amazon Prime or wherever streaming somewhere. But if you want to see, it's generally awful, but it sort of gives his story. But, this idea of a man whose life was sort of built around patriotism, public service, and then a willingness to fight for the Jewish people at a moment when Jewish life was really in danger, the life of the Jewish state, the life of, of Jews everywhere. That would seem, we need a hero like that, perhaps more than ever, simply because these are ideas that are so much under fire, aren't they?
I couldn't agree with you more. The saga of the movie itself, Cast a Giant Shadow, is also instructive. It basically wasn't going to get made, except that these people, mostly John Wayne, who was approached by Mirisch, who had turned down the movie or the rights to the movie or to make the movie, I think, originally, but was persuaded to do it. There were also resistance by the business types because they had assets in Arab countries and they were afraid that it would be boycotted, which would probably be true.
I think Frank Sinatra's in it too, isn't he?
And Sinatra, though, is a very interesting figure. And
he's also a big supporter of Israel.
I came across him when I was researching the book. He was a fundraiser for the air gun. Now, Marcus wasn't directly associated with the air gun, but he knew them and he knew their supporters. And he maintained his connections with Hollywood and with the New York theater community. He was also a lover of opera, Vicky and Emma. So he was in the New York cultural scene as well. He knew these people. But I can't imagine making this movie now. In fact, when I was trying to get a publisher for first Omar Bradley and then Mickey Marcus, I sent it to academic presses primarily, who I thought might be sympathetic, including universities that we both went to that have academic presses. And it was rejected everywhere, not even with the decency of a personal response. And it was only that the University of Missouri was willing and wanted to back my work that I think this book got published. So it is not an easy time for someone who's writing a book about Jews in most, I would say, mainstream publishing.
Yeah, I think we hear this from the publishing industry. I mean, there's anti-Semitism is now back in fashion. Jewish topics are not encouraged by major publishers, except if they are, critical of Israel and the Jews. Those are books that can, always get you published. But as I said, this is a story that I think more people need to know, and they need to be reintroduced to it at a time when, sort of virtue signaling against Israel, against the Jewish people is so popular among American Jewry and certainly among, mainstream culture. We may need Mickey Marcus today and his legacy and his story of heroism probably more than ever.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there is a group called Ironbound Films that has made some documentaries about Jewish subjects and is making a documentary right now that's going to feature Mickey Marcus. I've been, in fact, I was in Mickey and Emma's house in Brooklyn, where the documentary filmmakers interviewed me about Marcus, sitting in his living room, because the owner of the house now knows the story because the people in the neighborhood still know the story. So, yes, this is a living, vibrant tale about the founding of Israel and the crucial role of the United States, and a wonderful hero.
Thank you so much for doing this today. We're way over time. We could probably talk about this for a lot longer. I do recommend Chasing the Shadow. It's a really, I think, important topic and a good book. It's a good read. If you care about history, if you care about the history of American Jewry as well as the history of Israel, it's something that you should pick up. I do recommend it. And we also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which can be found on all of the various podcast platforms. And whether you're listening to us on any of those platforms, watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel. Please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.